Luke Roar had learned to live with silence the way other men lived with breathing. But when Dust returned that October morning, without the usual rhythm of hoofbeats, something in the stillness felt different, wrong, like a prayer interrupted mid-word. The horse's flanks trembled with exhaustion, and clinging to the saddle was something that would shatter Luke's carefully constructed solitude forever. What the rancher's horse brought back that day wasn't just a wounded Apache woman named Nia. It was the truth that would force a broken man to choose between the safety of his grief and the dangerous path of justice. Subscribe to discover how one moment of unexpected courage can change everything in the unforgiving Arizona frontier. The sun rose over Luke Roar's ranch like it had for 3 years running, painting the same shadows across the same weathered boards, marking time that felt more like punishment than passage. He stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the horizon where Sarah used to appear on her morning rides, her laughter carrying across the desert like water over stones. The silence had become his companion, reliable and undemanding, asking nothing of him except that he continue breathing, continue moving through the motions of a life that felt borrowed from someone else. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged beyond his 42 years, lines carved deep by loss and solitude, eyes that had forgotten how to hope for anything beyond the next sunset. Dust nickered from the corral, the sound cutting through the morning stillness like a blade through fabric. The horse had been Sarah's favorite, a paint with markings that reminded her of storm clouds, and Luke had kept him more out of habit than affection, unable to sell what remained of her joy. The animal paced restlessly, head high and ears pricked toward the eastern hills where the Apache territories began, that invisible line that separated the known from the dangerous, the civilized from the wild. Luke set down his cup and stepped onto the porch, boots echoing hollow against the worn planks, the sound swallowed immediately by the vast emptiness that surrounded his small island of human habitation. Something in Dust's behavior spoke of urgency, of knowledge that transcended the simple needs of hay and water. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, promising relief from the drought that had gripped the territory for months. Luke's nearest neighbor lived 15 miles south, and the town of Copper Creek lay a hard day's ride to the west, leaving him suspended in a landscape that seemed designed for solitude, for men who had lost their way and needed space to disappear. He had chosen this isolation deliberately after Sarah's death, fleeing the sympathetic looks and well-meaning words that felt like salt in an open wound, seeking a place where grief could run its course without witnesses. The ranch provided just enough work to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied, repairing fences that kept nothing in and nothing out, tending cattle that grazed on land too stubborn to surrender to the desert. Dust's restlessness grew more pronounced as the sun climbed higher, the horse moving in tight circles, occasionally stopping to stare toward the hills with an intensity that made Luke's skin prickle with unease. The animal had always possessed an uncanny awareness of things beyond human perception, sensing storms hours before they appeared, knowing when predators moved through the territory, responding to currents in the air that remained invisible to lesser creatures. Sarah used to say that Dust could read the desert's moods like other horses read their riders, and watching him now, Luke felt the first stirring of something that might have been concern, or perhaps just the echo of instincts he had thought buried with his wife. The decision to saddle Dust came without conscious thought, his hands moving through the familiar motions, while his mind remained caught between the safety of routine and the pull of something undefined. The leather felt warm under his fingers, worn smooth by years of use, and the horse stood perfectly still as Luke tightened the cinch, as if understanding that this morning would be different from all the others that had come before. The rifle slid into its scabbard with a whisper of metal against leather, a sound that spoke of preparation for possibilities he preferred not to name, and as he swung into the saddle, Luke felt the weight of choice settling around him like dust after a windstorm. They rode east toward the hills, where the morning light painted the rocks in shades of gold and amber. Dust moving with purpose now, his earlier agitation transformed into focused determination. The landscape unfolded before them in waves of stone and scrub, beautiful and merciless in equal measure, a place where survival depended on reading signs that most men never learned to see, where the difference between life and death could be measured in the space between heartbeats. Luke let the horse choose their path, trusting instincts that had kept them both alive through 3 years of careful isolation, and as they climbed higher into the hills, he felt something stirring in his chest that he had not experienced since Sarah's funeral. The dangerous, intoxicating possibility that this day might matter. The creek ran shallow between banks lined with cottonwoods, their leaves already touched with autumn's gold, whispering secrets to the wind that Luke had long since stopped trying to understand. Dust approached the water with unusual caution, ears swiveling like compass needles seeking true north, and it was then that Luke saw her. A figure collapsed at the water's edge, dark hair spread across the sand like spilled ink, wrists bound with leather thongs that had cut deep enough to stain the creek's edge with drops of crimson. She wore the traditional dress of the Apache, but the fabric was torn and stained with travel, and around her neck hung a leather pouch that seemed to pulse with significance even in her unconsciousness. The sight hit Luke like a physical blow, shattering the careful numbness he had cultivated, forcing him to confront the reality that suffering existed beyond the boundaries of his own grief. He dismounted slowly, every instinct screaming warnings about Apache territory and the consequences of involvement. But something in the woman's stillness spoke of a desperation that transcended tribal boundaries or personal safety. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and when he knelt beside her, Luke could see the fever burning in her dark skin, the way her body trembled despite the morning warmth, the careful positioning that spoke of injuries beyond what the eye could see. The leather pouch at her throat bore markings he didn't recognize, symbols carved with the precision of ritual significance, and as his fingers worked to free her wrists from their bonds, Luke felt the weight of stepping across a line he could never uncross, of choosing involvement over the safety of isolation. Nia, for that was the name she whispered when consciousness briefly returned, weighed almost nothing in his arms, her body light as dried sage, and as Luke lifted her onto Dust's back, he caught a glimpse of intelligence in her dark eyes, a fierce awareness that spoke of strength temporarily defeated but not destroyed. The horse accepted his double burden without complaint, as if understanding that this moment had been inevitable, that all their morning rides had been leading to this convergence of need and capability, of one person's desperation meeting another's reluctant compassion. The journey back to the ranch passed in a blur of careful navigation and whispered reassurances, Luke's voice rusty from disuse as he spoke words of comfort to a woman who might not understand his language, but could surely read the intention behind his tone. The ranch house had not sheltered another human being since Sarah's death, and as Luke carried Nia across the threshold, he felt the walls themselves seem to exhale, as if the building had been holding its breath for 3 years, waiting for life to return to its empty rooms. He settled her in the spare bedroom, the one Sarah had always intended for the children they never had, and as he worked to clean her wounds and assess her injuries, Luke found himself moving with a purpose he had forgotten he possessed, his hands steady and sure despite the trembling in his chest. The leather pouch remained around her neck, and though every practical instinct told him to examine its contents, something deeper warned him that such knowledge would come with a price he might not be prepared to pay. When Nia's eyes opened fully for the first time, they held a mixture of gratitude and wariness that Luke recognized from his own mirror, the look of someone who had learned that survival often depended on expecting the worst while hoping for something better. She spoke in Apache at first, words that flowed like water over stone, musical and urgent, and when Luke shook his head in incomprehension, she switched to halting English, her voice carrying the weight of secrets that could reshape the very foundations of justice in the territory. The pouch, she explained, contained proof of her father's innocence, evidence that would expose the corruption that had branded him a traitor and condemned him to death. But the men who pursued her would kill anyone who stood between them and the destruction of that truth. As the implications of her words settled over him like dust after a storm, Luke felt the last vestiges of his carefully constructed isolation crumbling away, replaced by something that might have been purpose or might have been the simple recognition that some fights chose their fighters rather than the other way around. The woman in his spare bedroom carried more than wounds and exhaustion. She carried the weight of injustice itself, and in accepting responsibility for her safety, Luke had unknowingly accepted responsibility for confronting the darkness that had driven her to his doorstep, forever changing not just his own fate, but the destiny of everyone who would stand with them against the corruption that poisoned the Arizona frontier. The leather pouch felt heavier in Luke's calloused hands than any saddle he'd ever lifted, its worn surface telling stories of desperate journeys and hidden secrets. Nia sat wrapped in his late wife's quilt, her dark eyes following his every movement as he examined the intricate beadwork that decorated the ancient container. The firelight danced across her bruised face, casting shadows that seemed to deepen with each revelation she shared about the conspiracy that had torn her family apart. Her father, Chief Ayana, had been branded a traitor by corrupt Indian agents who sought to steal tribal lands through fabricated evidence and false testimony. The pouch contained the only proof of his innocence, sacred documents and witness accounts that could expose the web of lies that had destroyed her people's trust and sent her fleeing into the desert. Luke's weathered fingers traced the beadwork as Nia's voice grew stronger, her words painting a picture of betrayal so vast it reached from the reservation offices to the territorial capital. Outside, Dust paced restlessly in the corral, his ears pricked toward the distant hills, where danger lurked like a patient predator. The horse's instincts had never failed Luke before, and tonight they screamed warnings that made his skin crawl with anticipation. Nia explained how the corrupt agents had discovered her father's investigation into their illegal land deals, how they had planted evidence of collaboration with hostile tribes to discredit him before he could expose their crimes. The shackles that had bound her wrists were not the restraints of a prisoner, but the desperate attempt of her captors to prevent her from reaching the territorial judge with the evidence that could clear her father's name. Luke felt the familiar weight of his colt against his hip, knowing that the men who had pursued Nia across the desert would not simply abandon their hunt because she had found sanctuary. The truth she carried was worth more than gold to those who sought to bury it, and they would kill anyone who stood between them and their prize. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the cabin windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry, and Luke found himself studying Nia's face in the flickering light. Her beauty was not the soft prettiness of town women, but the fierce elegance of someone forged by hardship and tempered by loss. When she spoke of her father's honor, her voice carried the weight of generations, the pride of a people who had never surrendered their dignity despite the endless attempts to strip it away. Luke recognized something in her eyes that mirrored his own grief. The hollow ache of watching everything precious slip away like water through desperate fingers. Yet where his loss had driven him into isolation, hers had ignited a fire that burned with the intensity of righteous purpose. He found himself drawn to that flame, feeling something stir within his chest that he had thought died with Sarah 3 years ago. The leather pouch seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as Nia revealed the names of the corrupt officials whose signatures appeared on the forged documents. Territorial Agent Morrison, Land Commissioner Bradley, and Judge Whitman, men whose reputations were built on the graves of those they had betrayed. Luke knew these names, had seen their faces in the territorial newspapers, had even voted for some of them in elections, where he believed their promises of justice and progress. The revelation that they were the architects of a conspiracy designed to steal Apache lands for their own profit sent a cold rage through his veins. Nia's father had gathered evidence of their crimes over months of careful investigation, documenting bribes, forged treaties, and murdered witnesses with the methodical precision of a man who understood that truth was the only weapon powerful enough to defeat such corruption. The pouch contained not just documents, but the hopes of an entire people who had been branded as savages, while the real monsters wore suits and carried government credentials. As the night deepened, Luke found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The isolation that had protected him from further loss now felt like cowardice in the face of Nia's courage. She had risked everything to preserve her father's legacy and expose the truth, while he had hidden behind his grief like a shield against the world's demands. The weight of the evidence in his hands was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He looked into Nia's eyes and saw not just a woman seeking help, but a warrior who had chosen him as her ally in a battle that would determine whether justice could survive in a territory where corruption had taken root like poison ivy. The comfortable numbness that had sustained him through 3 years of solitude began to crack, revealing the man he had been before loss had hollowed him out. The sound of approaching hoofbeats in the distance made both of them freeze, their eyes meeting across the small cabin with shared understanding of what was coming. Luke rose slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt, as Dust's warning whinny cut through the night air like a blade. The men who had pursued Nia across the desert had found them, drawn by the smoke from his chimney and the light in his windows that had seemed so welcoming just hours before. Nia clutched the pouch to her chest, her knuckles white with determination, and Luke realized that the choice was no longer whether to help her, it was whether they would live long enough to see justice done. The comfortable isolation of his ranch had become a fortress under siege, and the man who had spent 3 years avoiding conflict was about to discover whether he still possessed the courage to fight for something greater than his own grief. The hoofbeats grew closer, their rhythm matching the thundering of Luke's heart as he moved through his cabin with the practiced efficiency of a man who had faced danger before. He extinguished the oil lamp with a sharp breath, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by the dying embers in the fireplace, their red glow casting dancing shadows on the walls, like spirits preparing for battle. Nia pressed herself against the far wall, the leather pouch clutched against her chest like a shield, her breathing controlled despite the terror that flickered in her dark eyes. Luke checked his rifle, the familiar weight of the Winchester bringing back memories of other nights when violence had come calling, though none had carried stakes as high as the truth that now rested in his cabin. Through the window, he could see the silhouettes of riders approaching, their movements deliberate and predatory, like wolves circling wounded prey. The moonlight caught the glint of metal, guns drawn and ready, badges that gleamed with false authority, faces hidden beneath hat brims that cast shadows deeper than the night itself. Dust's warning calls from the corral had taken on a frantic edge, the horse's instincts screaming danger with every fiber of his being. Luke counted at least 6 riders, their formation suggesting military training corrupted by criminal purpose, men who wore the law like a mask while serving masters who dealt in blood and stolen land. The lead rider raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt just beyond rifle range, his voice carrying across the desert air with the cold authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Luke Roar, we know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to us," the man called, his words dripping with false reasonableness that barely concealed the violence beneath. "Send out the Apache woman and the item she stole, and we'll ride away peaceful-like. No need for anyone to get hurt over a misunderstanding." Luke felt Naya's hand touch his shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly as she whispered the names of the men outside, bounty hunters and corrupt lawmen who had been hunting her across 3 territories, leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. The silence that followed the demand stretched like a taut wire, filled with the weight of decisions that would echo through the rest of their lives. Luke knew that surrender meant death for Nia and the burial of truth that could free her father and expose the conspiracy that had poisoned the territorial government. Yet resistance meant facing odds that would challenge even a younger man with nothing to lose. And he was no longer the fearless cowboy who had once faced down rustlers and claim jumpers with reckless courage. The years of grief had softened his edges, made him cautious in ways that might prove fatal when speed and decisiveness were the only things standing between them and destruction. Nia seemed to sense his hesitation, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke of her willingness to surrender herself if it would spare his life, her words carrying the nobility of someone prepared to sacrifice everything for the sake of another's safety. The offer cut through Luke's uncertainty like a blade, reminding him of the man he had been before loss had taught him to value safety over honor. Outside, the riders grew impatient, their horses stamping and snorting as the men exchanged glances that spoke of violence barely held in check. The leader's voice came again, harder this time, stripped of its false courtesy like bark peeled from a dead tree. "You've got 1 minute to think it over, Roar. After that we come in shooting, and whatever happens to you is on your own head." Luke could hear the metallic clicks of hammers being pulled back, the soft creak of leather as men shifted in their saddles, preparing for the assault that would turn his peaceful cabin into a battlefield. The weight of his rifle felt both familiar and foreign in his hands, muscle memory warring with 3 years of disuse, the calluses on his trigger finger softened by time and neglect. Yet as he looked at Nia's face in the dying firelight, he saw something that rekindled the fire he thought had died with Sarah. The fierce determination of someone fighting not just for survival, but for the right of truth to exist in a world that preferred comfortable lies. The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass cascading across the cabin floor like fallen stars, the sound triggering an avalanche of violence that transformed the peaceful night into chaos. Luke dropped to one knee, returning fire through the broken window, his first shot taking down the rider on the left with the precision that came from years of hunting and defending his land. Nia crawled toward the back of the cabin, clutching the pouch that contained her father's vindication, her movements quick and silent as bullets splintered the wooden walls around them. The attackers spread out, their tactics revealing the military training that corruption had twisted into criminal purpose, surrounding the cabin with the methodical efficiency of men who had done this before. Luke's second shot missed its mark, the bullet disappearing into the darkness beyond the riders, but it served its purpose of keeping them honest, forcing them to take cover behind rocks and scrub brush instead of charging directly at the cabin. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the dust kicked up by frightened horses and the metallic taste of fear that coated the back of his throat. The battle raged with the intensity of a summer storm, each exchange of gunfire illuminating the night like lightning, revealing glimpses of desperate faces and gleaming weapons before darkness reclaimed the desert. Luke moved from window to window, using his knowledge of the cabin's layout to stay ahead of the bullets that sought his life, while Nia proved herself more than a helpless victim by reloading his spare rifle with hands that remained steady despite the chaos surrounding them. One of the attackers tried to circle around to the back door, but Dust's frantic warnings alerted Luke to the danger, allowing him to position himself for a shot that sent the man tumbling from his horse with a cry that was swallowed by the night wind. The leather pouch lay between them on the cabin floor, its presence a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. Not just their lives, but the hope that truth could still triumph over corruption in a territory where justice had become a commodity to be bought and sold. As the gunfire continued, Luke realized that the boy who had once dreamed of taming the frontier had finally become the man who would fight to save it from those who sought to own it. The gunfire ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to echo with the ghosts of bullets that had found their marks. Luke pressed his back against the cabin wall, his chest heaving as he tried to count the remaining attackers through the haze of gun smoke that drifted through the shattered windows like morning fog. 3 bodies lay motionless in the moonlight, their forms twisted in the unnatural angles of violent death, while the surviving riders had pulled back beyond rifle range to reassess their strategy. Naya crouched beside him, her face streaked with dust and determination, the leather pouch still clutched in her hands like a sacred relic that had somehow survived the storm of lead and fury. The cabin bore the scars of battle, splintered wood, shattered glass, and bullet holes that would forever mark this night as the moment when Luke Raw chose to rejoin the world of the living. Outside, dusk calls had taken on a different tone. No longer warnings of approaching danger, but something that sounded almost like encouragement, as if the horse understood that his master had finally remembered who he was meant to be. The remaining attackers regrouped in the distance, their hushed voices carrying across the desert air as they debated their next move. Luke could see them silhouetted against the star-filled sky, 3 men whose confidence had been shaken by the unexpected resistance they had encountered. The leader, a man whose badge gleamed with false authority, gestured angrily toward the cabin, his words lost in the wind but his frustration clear in every movement. These were men accustomed to easy victories, to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers who lacked the will or skill to fight back, and Luke's defiance had disrupted their carefully laid plans. Naya whispered that she recognized the leader as Deputy Marshal Crawford, one of the corrupt officials whose name appeared in her father's evidence, a man who had used his position to eliminate witnesses and destroy documents that threatened the conspiracy. The revelation sent a cold fury through Luke's veins, knowing that he was facing not just criminals, but the very men sworn to uphold the law they had perverted for their own gain. As the night wore on, Luke found himself studying Nia's profile in the dim light that filtered through the broken windows. Her beauty had been refined by hardship into something more precious than mere prettiness, a strength that shone from within like a flame that no amount of suffering could extinguish. She spoke softly of her father, Chief Ayana, describing a man who had tried to bridge the gap between 2 worlds, seeking justice through the white man's courts, even as his own people urged him toward the warpath. The evidence in the pouch represented years of careful investigation, documented proof of land frauds, murdered witnesses, and forged treaties that had stolen millions of acres from the Apache Nation. Luke realized that he was holding not just the key to one man's vindication, but the foundation for a reckoning that could reshape the entire territory. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a mantle he had never asked for, but could no longer refuse to wear. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both tense, but these came from a different direction, accompanied by voices that carried the authority of legitimate law enforcement. Luke peered through the window to see a new group of riders approaching, their leader wearing the silver star of a territorial marshal, his bearing suggesting a man who had earned his position through merit rather than corruption. Deputy Marshal Crawford and his remaining men found themselves caught between Luke's cabin and the approaching lawman, their escape routes suddenly cut off by the very justice they had sought to pervert. Nia's eyes widened with recognition as she identified the lead rider as Marshal Thompson, one of the few honest officials in the territorial government, a man her father had trusted with preliminary evidence before the conspiracy had forced him into hiding. The arrival of legitimate authority transformed the night from a desperate last stand into something that resembled hope, though Luke knew that the battle for truth was far from over. The confrontation that followed played out like a scene from the dime novels Luke had once read, but with stakes that were all too real. Marshal Thompson's voice cut through the desert air with the authority of genuine law, demanding that Crawford and his men surrender their weapons and submit to arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the territorial government. The corrupt deputy marshal's response was a desperate attempt to maintain his false authority, claiming that he was pursuing dangerous fugitives who had attacked federal officers in the performance of their duties. But the evidence was overwhelming. The bodies of the men Luke had killed bore the marks of bounty hunters and hired guns, not legitimate lawmen, and their presence at his cabin could only be explained by their pursuit of Nia and the truth she carried. The leather pouch that had seemed so fragile in the firelight now appeared to pulse with its own power, its contents representing the difference between justice and the continued reign of corruption that had poisoned the Arizona Territory. The final moments of the confrontation unfolded with the swift inevitability of sunrise, as Crawford's remaining men chose surrender over a hopeless fight against overwhelming odds. Luke emerged from his battle-scarred cabin, with Nia at his side, the leather pouch held high like a banner of victory, its beadwork catching the first rays of dawn that painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Marshal Thompson's weathered face broke into a smile as he recognized the significance of what they had preserved through the long night of violence, knowing that the evidence would finally bring justice to those who had thought themselves above the law. As the corrupt officials were led away in shackles, Luke felt something shift within his chest, the ice that had surrounded his heart for 3 years beginning to crack and melt in the warmth of purpose rediscovered. Nia's hand found his as they watched the sunrise paint the sky with promise, and he realized that Dust's restless behavior had brought him more than just a wounded woman to rescue. It had brought him back to life itself. Back to the man he was meant to be in a world that still needed heroes willing to fight for truth.